So I hope you enjoyed this morning. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. If you had a chance to get outside, when I got up here, I thought, oh, I was going to go outside and I forgot. But it is a beautiful day out there. So I have the honor of introducing Dr. Mark Fenske. I hope I pronounced that right. Dr. Fenske is a neuroscientist, and I always wanted to be able to say that I know a neuroscientist, so I've just gotten to know Mark better, so that's a great thing. Mark is a former member of the Harvard Medical School. He was in Boston, but right now he's homegrown. He's down the road in Guelph, though I just learned he actually grew up in Lethbridge, Alberta, so those people from out west can feel that there's some really homegrown from there. His research combines neuroimaging and the studies of behavior to examine the brain's attention and emotion systems that can enhance performance. He is also the author of The Winner's Brain. And I was telling Mark that I ordered this so that I'd have it for today. And of course it didn't come in, but Mark had it in his trunk. So he does actually have copies that he might be able to sell if you're interested afterwards. And Dr. Fenske is going to talk about brain development and how it explains what we know about our self-regulation, and the factors underlying the failures when that related to that. So I'm going to leave it to you, Mark, okay?
Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you all for being here. I'm really glad that I could get a chance to talk to you guys. And I think, just at the outset, I think it's important for me to emphasize, I'm not a clinician, right? I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. Most of my time, up until a few years ago, has been spent doing basic research, basic studies, trying to understand things like attention and emotion and how these things work, how they interact, how they support our judgments and decisions and things like that. And probably maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, have gone from a point of really focusing on those basic research questions to instead thinking about, are there ways in which we can apply what we're learning about the brain and about these basic important faculties to try to help people. So starting to do some work with people with depression, people with problem gambling, some with addiction, things like this. So a lot of what I have to say comes from that basic science perspective, and what I'm hoping today is that some of what I'll talk about will resonate well from your clinical experiences, and I'd be happy to have questions or discussion afterwards to talk about ways in which we might be able to build those bridges a little bit better, try to enhance this sort of application. So I think from the outset, when I give talks like this, very often it's to people who don't have a lot of background in neuroscience to begin with, and a big objective, the first objective, is just to convince people that they should in fact take some time to learn a little bit about the brain. And so very often that will be, talking to people like you. You guys should care about the brain. You should care about the way that your brain works, but also understanding from your perspective that you're dealing with and providing care to people who might also need to be convinced that they should worry about the way that their brain works. And so we come to this question, why should young people, they've got lots of things already to occupy their time, why should they care about the way that their brains work? And this is basically to the point that no matter who you are, your brain is responsible for everything about you. The way that you perceive the world, the way that you think, the way that you feel, your skills, your abilities, the way that you interact with other people, your conscious experience of everything, that comes down to what's going on in the brain. And all you have to do, if you have any doubt about that, is go and talk to somebody with Alzheimer's disease or somebody who's had a stroke or has some other neurological impairment to be able to see how profoundly you can change even the very personality characteristics of an individual through changes in the brain. So another part of why I'm able to talk about the brain really has to do with advances that we've had in technology. And I'm not going to go into a lot of details about this, but really over the last 20, 30 years, we've had major advances in things like magnetic resonance imaging, which you see on your top left, magnetoencephalography, which allows us to look at changes in magnetic fields that correspond to brain activity in specific regions, this big hairdryer looking thing on the right, electroencephalography, which allows us to measure electrical activity, and transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, which allows us to temporarily disrupt brain activity in a given region to be able to assess its causal role in supporting the way that we think, feel, and behave. And ultimately, what these techniques allow us to do is to be able to get unprecedented views at individual differences in brain structure. We heard a lot about that earlier today, about changes in white matter, the connections between brain areas, changes in the thickness of the gray matter, rather the sort of outer covering of the brain where we have most of the computational power. We're able to look at those changes in structure, but also then to relate those to changes in functional patterns of activation, and specifically how these changes in structure and function support thoughts, feelings, the way that we interact with other people and behaviors. And from these, we've been able to learn things like different parts of the brain are specialized to do different things. And this is a really important idea, this idea of functional specialization. And again, without going into a lot of detail, it's just this point. We talk about cognitive control, the ability to focus on something, the ability to resist distraction, the ability to control your emotions. We know that has a lot to do with lateral prefrontal areas, the planning and decisions, executive things. Memory, the hippocampus is a subcortical structure, really important for that. The reason why this idea about functional specialization is so important is because we've already heard a little bit about neuroplasticity before today, but especially this idea about experience-dependent neuroplasticity, that what you do with your brain, how you engage those different parts of the brain can have an impact not only in your ability to do the underlying abilities, a given task, but also to literally reshape the physical landscape of the brain itself. So the challenge that's faced a lot of us over the last few years is to be able to understand, all right, which parts of the brain are involved in a given activity, what are the patterns of communication between these different brain regions, and then what are the different tasks, the different activities in which we engage that can engage these brain areas and try to either make them work better, build better connections, the synapses to allow more efficient communication, or to reduce some of the communication for behaviors that maybe, or patterns of thought that we aren't so happy to be having. So, the bottom line, brain's responsible for everything. So for everybody, yourself, for the people that you work with, your brain is your most important asset. And if it's not working well, then you're not going to feel or think or behave very well either. And this is essentially, like I said, this idea of neuroplasticity, that we can think of the brain constantly as a work in progress. This is especially important for youth and children who we might be working with or interact with, but it's also important for everybody. Contrary to what I was taught when I was an undergraduate, which was that the brain is relatively fixed once you get past adolescence, we know that's no longer the case. We were told, as a student I was, that the brain's incapable of change once you get past that point, or even worse, it can change due to stroke, or aging, or other sorts of negative ways, but in fact now we know that it can retain the capacity for positive change. So bottom line is the brain is always essentially a work in progress. And we heard a little bit about some of these principles of neuroplasticity. Neurons that fire together, wire together, building these synaptic connections. Neurons out of sync fail to link, which is kind of this use it or lose it principle that we also heard a little bit about this morning. So the winner's brain, and really from my perspective as a scientist, having done a lot of this basic research and a lot of this stuff that we're learning about the brain through these new imaging techniques, when I got contacted about writing the winner's brain, it was very exciting because I said, you know, I'm spending lots of my waking life studying these things. I'm really excited about it, and it's clear that these things have some implications for other people. But the challenge is to be able to take that science, which is very detailed, very complex, and to try to be able to translate that and make it accessible for everybody else who doesn't have that specific training. And the bottom line of the winner's brain then is to be able to take this cutting-edge research that we have and to be able to translate in ways to say, what are the sorts of activities that we can engage in to be able to help us to be able to obtain whatever objectives that we might have, whether that's to be, you know, better at making friends, or better at keeping my goals, or not procrastinating, or having more motivation, or whatever those sorts of things is. The bottom line of all of this is that we don't have to be a passive recipient of life, but instead we can be proactive. That there's things that we can do to shape how our brains function, and ultimately to help us to find these ways to be more successful. So this is sort of the end of the kind of pitch that I give people, that learning a bit about their brain is really critical for being able to better develop it and take care of it. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the winner's brain beyond this. Basically what we've done is to identify different areas that we think are critical for success, everything from motivation, memory, focus, things like that. Instead, what I want to do today, instead of going into a lot of that detail, is to focus on some of the essential elements, I guess, some of the principles that are really critical across a whole bunch of these different domains. And this really has a lot to do with self-regulation. So this idea that, and we know that individuals who have difficulty with self-control, with self-regulation, these are often the sorts of people that you'll be seeing in your practice, people who come for treatment, people who present with specific problems, and we're now finding ways in which self-control can be enhanced, ways in which we can get better at these things. So the first idea when it comes to self-control, self-regulation, I think from the perspective of the brain, is this essential idea that the brain is a battleground. I've already told you about these different areas of the brain that are specialized to do different things. And those areas will do their thing. You have neurons there that are, their job is to respond in some cases to the color red, in some cases to faces. We heard about the fusiform face area. The cells there, anytime that a face comes into the field of view, they go nuts, they start firing. And all of these different brain regions are putting out their signal, and they're competing. They're vying to win the race to become the contents of your thoughts and your actions. So you've got these different brain regions battling it out, trying to determine who's going to win that battle to control your thoughts, to control your actions. And the reason why we have this competition is because ultimately we have this limited capacity. We can only think about so many things at once. We can only do so many things at once, which means we have to prioritize. Which of the different things are we going to do? What are we going to pay attention to? What are the things that we're going to allow to drive our behavior? Right, so we've got this constant competition to determine what becomes the focus of our thoughts and actions. And this idea of control, self-control, the regulation, this is really about cognitive control. This idea that there is something that we can do, we can exert some sort of effort, we can do something strategically based on our goals to try to bias this competition between the different brain signals in favor of a certain outcome, really to try to meet our different objectives. But this idea about the brain as a battleground, this competition between different brain signals, this forms the basis of a lot of the different situations in which we see difficulties or the need for individuals to exert self-control. So let's take an example here, right? Our decisions, actions are influenced by lots of different competing signals. I lived in Boston for a little while. If anybody spent much time driving around Boston, you'll realize that really the only way it seems to get from one place to another is to constantly honk your horn and yell at people, which of course, if you're having a bad day, that can lead to these very strong emotional impulses. Oftentimes you spend your time cursing at others underneath your breath, hopefully, if your kids are in the car. That's one way to respond to these sorts of situations. We've got these emotional impulses, the lizard brain sorts of impulses that we heard about this morning. But we also have other signals related to our long-term goals. The idea that I don't want to be known as a hothead. I'd like to be in control of my temper. I know what's socially appropriate. But I've got this competition between these different brain signals. Who's going to win? What ultimately is going to be the outcome? And the old view, and it's amazing to me still how pervasive this view is when I talk to people, even within my own family, who think that a lack of willpower is somehow a moral defect of character. That is who you are. That guy's a hothead. You know, oh, he's really a firecracker. He can't really handle himself. Like this trait that's immutable, it's not going to change. And instead of that old view, what I'd like to suggest is that by understanding a little bit about how the brain exerts self-control, or maybe even more importantly, the ways in which it fails at exerting self-control, can really help us to be able to find ways in which we can make it better. So let's take another example of self-control to try to illustrate some of these principles. So this idea that self-control takes cognitive effort. is difficult. So when you're faced with a situation like this, you go to the restaurant and you're like, oh, do I go for the fries? Every time I see this image, I want fries because those fries look really tasty. We know they're really good. The reward property of fries, the fat, the salt, that's a super stimulus is what we talk about it. It's really highly developed to drive reward-related behavior, which is to eat the fries and not the broccoli. And in fact, if we show images like this to people while they're in the MRI scanner, take functional magnetic resonance imaging, looking at changes in blood oxygenation, indicating neural activity, what do we see? When people look at the fries compared to the broccoli, you get a big increase in activity in that red spot, that ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This is one of the brain's hedonic hotspots. This is saying, oh goody, that is going to taste really good, and yes, let's go for the fries. If instead you have people, instead of saying which of these is going to taste better or how tasty do you think this will be, you have them make the judgment, which of these do you think is going to be better for your health, or how good is this thing for your health? What do we see is an increase in activity, the green spot there, in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And as a general rule of thumb, the way that the brain is organized, regions on the top and outermost parts of the brain are generally involved more so in cognitive control, strategic thinking, top-down sorts of things. The more ventral and medial, so lower and inner parts of the brain, tend to be those that are more emotion, reward, hedonic sorts of processes. So what happens? We ask people to think about which of these is going to be better for you. How healthy is this? You see an increase in cognitive control regions, and at the same time, we see a decrease in the strength of the signal from that reward-related area. It's like exerting cognitive control can literally turn down the volume on those reward-related signals. A very simple way to think about it is that little green dot that you see there, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the angel on one shoulder, and that red spot is the devil on the other shoulder, and like I said, they're battling it out. Who's going to win? So this is difficult, and it's not just food. We can talk about the challenges or the situations in which younger people face. They might not be so worried about the French fries versus broccoli. It's pretty clear to them. They're always going to go with the French fries. What about playing video games versus doing homework or any other sort of decision that's challenging? Why is it challenging? Because you have a very appealing option on one hand and something that, at least for the immediate present, is not so appealing. Even if you know this is going to be better for me not to do this thing, still this other option is very rewarding. So lots of these situations where it's the battle between, very highly appealing prospect versus something that's maybe less appealing. Well, we know that this area, this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and we heard a bit about this morning, this is among the last of the frontal lobe regions to fully develop. This is just an animation of the same figure that we saw earlier today, showing changes in cortical development from 5 to 20, and this area that's circled, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, really area strongly involved in cognitive control, the last to mature. And it's not just maturation, changes in synaptic density within that area, the connections between the brain cells in that area, but it's also its communications, the ability to communicate, the connections between that area and other areas downstream. If you don't have good connectivity, the white matter tracks that we heard about, good communication between these top-down control areas and these more limbic emotion reward areas, who's going to win the battle? You're not able to turn the signal down. It's always going to be these more hedonic, reward-driven processes that are going to be more likely to win. So when we look at youth, when we look at children, the fact that prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, the connections between prefrontal cortex to these other subcortical regions isn't fully developed. This, in part, explains why we see some of the challenges that we have with young people, right? Well-developed limbic reward system, so they've got the strong emotion, the reward-seeking impulses, but they have underdeveloped cognitive control system, really lacking the ability in critical situations to turn the volume down on those critical signals. So the implications, just again, these are obvious to anyone who's worked with, especially youth with specific problems, increased risk-taking, susceptibility to addiction, but also the flip side, greater impact of positive reward. You think about the most thrilling, experiences of your life, or the people who've had the greatest impact, positive impact. Very often those examples come from period of adolescence, right? Because it's not just the negative things, but it's also the positive things that can have very salient impact on our thoughts and behavior. So this idea about exerting cognitive control, it really is a very cognitively demanding situation. And there's evidence to suggest that the energy that it takes, literally the energy that it takes, glucose, which is in our blood, right? What do these neurons do when they fire? They need energy to be able to fire. What's their source of fuel? Oxygen that's in the atmosphere. There's lots of that. What's a little bit less always available is glucose. So we get that from the food that we eat. So if you've just eaten, which we all have, our blood sugar levels are really nice. Wait a couple hours and the blood sugar starts going down. Those are the situations. So extended periods of activity can deplete those resources. If it's been a while since you've eaten, you can lack blood sugar. Evidence from Baumeister and Guyot and others suggests that, in fact, those depleted resources can lead to critical failures of self-regulation. So think about anyone who's had a toddler. When is your toddler most likely to throw a temper tantrum? When they're tired, when they're hungry. We somehow think that once we get past the toddler years that we are suddenly immune from those same challenges. When are we most irritable, most cranky, most likely to fly off the handle? When we're tired and when we're hungry. The same sort of thing happens. And lots of work has been done in adults, even in judges. And I do a lot of work with judges. I do judicial education. Judges like to make sure their brain's working fine. And some works come out that shows even judges, depending on how long it's been since they've eaten, has a profound impact on the amount of time that they take to deliberate a case, but also ultimately on the outcome. So judges on parole boards spend less time near lunch considering the merits of a case, and ultimately the person's application is much, much less likely to be approved, because what's the hard part of making a parole decision is to let somebody who's already clearly a bad guy back out into society. And the change is like 60% difference in the likelihood of being released. So if you have adults who are this susceptible to these sorts of fluctuations due to not having breaks often enough, not having eaten often enough, what about individuals whose cognitive control systems aren't already fully developed, or people with specific impairments, attention deficit, things like that, where we've got and we know there's problems with implementing cognitive control? What about kids who haven't had a decent breakfast, or who've had a long day dealing with stressful school or home situation? One of the critical findings within the realm of self-regulation, work by Roy Baumeister and others, has to do with what he talks about as ego depletion. Right? We heard about it this morning as overload, or taxing the system, which means if you spend a lot of time engaging in self-regulation, you might spend all day working with a difficult coworker or dealing with a difficult patient or client, and you do really well. You bite your tongue, you go all the way through. What happens is, as soon as you get home, somebody spills some milk or something, you fly off the handle, right? You've depleted those resources that you need to be able to exert self-regulation. So, in part, when we talk about what can we do to try to enhance self-regulation, the first point is, let's identify those situations in which we're in high regulation mode, those situations in which are those resources may be most likely to be depleted. Right? Nutritionists tell us don't eat big 3 meals a day, but instead eat smaller meals throughout the day. Try to keep your blood glucose levels constant. Will this work? And I have to mention, it's not entirely decided. There's still some people who say, well, maybe it's not exactly blood glucose. Maybe it's the reward of just getting a little bit of, because if you give somebody a glass of lemonade, suddenly they're better able at exerting self-control. Maybe it's just the rewarding properties of that. The bottom line is, without breaks, without proper nutrition, without proper blood glucose, these are the sorts of situations where it seems that people can get in the most trouble. So let's make sure, just basics. Have you slept? Have you eaten? Things like that. Get those out of the way, and then you can start thinking about the other more complex aspects of self-control. So how can we increase self-control? There's another aspect here. beyond just that, taking breaks and having good food. And this has to do with the way that self-control works. So think again about this idea of the battle in the brain, right? So there's two different places, two different foci of activation here that we might think about when it comes to self-control. One might be about what can we do to try to reduce the strength of that maladaptive signal, right? That has to do with the motivational incentive of a specific option. And so if instead of those fries, we leave them outside for a month and they turn all moldy, nobody's going to be salivating over, let me eat those fries. What have we done? We've reduced the motivational incentive. Those are no longer appealing. You're not going to get the same level of activation in those hedonic hotspots for something like that as you would for the nice fresh fries. So things that we can do to try to reduce the motivational salience of a particular option, that's going to tilt the balance in favor of us being able to exert self-control in terms of this competition. The other way is to focus on this cognitive control. What are the things that we can do to try to increase cognitive control? So are there things that we can do to try to increase the strength of those dorsolateral, prefrontal, other sorts of top-down mechanisms? Well, one thing that we know when it comes to youth and adolescents is to let them get a little bit older. That's going to strengthen that inhibitory control. But I'm going to talk a little bit about two lines of evidence from my lab just recently in which we've tackled each of these possibilities to try to enhance people's self-control. So the first of these, in terms of these routes to better self-regulation, one is about changing the salience, motivational salience of specific stimuli. And this just has to do with simple practice withholding a response from these very appealing items. And the other one are, is there things that we can do? Can we give a warm-up period before somebody engages in a very difficult self-regulation task to try to warm up these mechanisms to try to make self-control a little bit better? So ultimately, what's our goal? Is to reduce the strength of these maladaptive impulses. So what happens with cognitive inhibition, right? Attention helps us to turn up the volume on things that are relevant to us, to turn down the volume on things that are distracting or things that are otherwise irrelevant. And we can measure this. We can put electrodes in the brain to individual neurons and measure their change in activity when you're ignoring something. You get a reduction in activity for cells that would otherwise prefer to respond to that thing. But it turns out, and this is work that I've done a lot with Jane Raymond. I started off doing a postdoc with her in Wales and have continued to collaborate with her over the years. And what we found is that inhibition, the simple act of ignoring something or withholding a response from something, things that, at least back when I was a student, people would talk about as cold cognitive processes. We heard a little bit about that this morning too. The simple act of withholding a response or ignoring something is enough to change your emotional response to that thing later on. Here's the first instance in which we found this effect. Very simple task. Here's a 2-item visual search task. I show you this picture and I say, find the items with the circles on it. You have to look, find where the circles is, and you press either left or right. So what are you doing there? You're finding the one with the circles, you're paying attention to that item. In the process, you're ignoring the item that's made out of the squares. And afterwards, if we ask people, rate, tell me how cheerful, this was actually done in the UK, so it's, tell me how cheery you think this item is, and we ask them to either rate the item that they've just attended, the item that they've just ignored, or some new item that they've never seen before. And what do we see? The items that were ignored are devalued. They're liked less than either something that you've previously attended or something that you've never seen before. So we found that stimuli that are ignored become affectively devalued. So just on the face of it, why we were excited about this is because for years, people have talked about attention and cognitive control in very cold information processing terms. In fact, for decades, we talked about it like a computer. Information comes in, you store something in memory, and there's some kind of output. There's no emotion in your computer. So why would there be any emotion in these cognitive control sorts of scenarios? And what we were showing is that, in fact, there are these affective consequences. And so we have some ideas about how this happens and some fMRI data to support this view that what does inhibition do? Well, it really detects conflict. You see the circles, you see the squares. There's 2 items that are competing, right? for you to pay attention to them. And somehow, depending in this case on their features, you choose the one that's made out of circles, which means that now, based on this conflict, you exert cognitive control, this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex areas, to turn up the volume on things that are relevant to the circles and turn down the volume on the other thing. So you exert these inhibitory signals. Inhibit the thing with squares. So that's not really new. People have known a fair amount about how inhibition is triggered in the brain. What is new, though, is this idea that those inhibitory signals, through the connections from these top-down areas to the lizard brain, these subcortical regions, you have those connections, that those connections can then translate into a change in how you respond to this thing later on. So these inhibitory signals are interpreted as a type of avoidance response. Things that are distracting, you would rather not engage with, so you try to avoid them. Well, what do? We normally avoid things that we have negative affect for, and this is kind of that process in reverse. You've avoided something, therefore I must not like it. I generate this negative affect, and so this negative affective response through areas like the amygdala, orbital frontal cortex, these limbic, hedonic sort of areas that we've talked about before and heard about this morning. Well, now you have this negative affective response that becomes associated with aspects of that stimulus. So when you see it again, you're like, that thing just about messed me up last time. I do not want to engage with it. So this is all fine and dandy. What does this have to do with self-regulation? Well, my PhD student, Anne Ferry, she actually just graduated a few months ago, wanted to know whether we could take this basic effect, which you saw we had previously just used fairly meaningless stimuli, and actually use it to be able to modify the incentive value of stimuli that are associated with problems related to self-control, disorders of self-control. So, what's related to problems of self-control? Money, sex, drugs, food, you name those specific impulse control type problems. And she started off with sex-related stimuli in part Y. The rise of easy access to sexual material on the internet and others. There's been quite a bit of evidence to show that it seems to be a growing problem. Here's just one study by Cooper and colleagues that shows of the sample that they looked at, about 17% of this entire sample scored in this problematic range of sexually compulsive behavior based only on sexually explicit material that they're observing online. So he said, oh, all right, let's start with sexually relevant material. The other part for choosing sex stimuli is that even though ultimately, I have to admit, we're really interested in, can we take somebody who's had a history of substance abuse, let's say they've been smoking crack for a long time, they go and receive treatment, but now when they have to be reintegrated back into society, they've got triggers, drug-associated cues. They run into somebody who's got a crack pipe that elicits cravings, cravings elicits relapse. What can we do to make that crack pipe have less power in terms of eliciting those cravings? But we started with sex-related stimuli because also our main population is 17 to 25-year-old college students for whom we can show these sorts of material. So here's the task that Anne had. This is a go, no-go task. It's response inhibition. So you're supposed to press the space bar anytime that you see somebody with dark hair, and if they have light hair, you have to withhold a response. You have to inhibit the response that you get used to making after a number of trials. So you see somebody with dark hair, you press the space bar, see somebody with light hair, don't make a response. And of course, these are images of partially clothed individuals who pilot work shows, at least our undergraduate population has found to be quite attractive depending on their sexual preference. So we have them either inhibit a response to these items or respond to them, and afterwards we ask, how attractive do you find this individual to be? And then we look at, because some people are going to be more attracted to some sex than others, and we're really interested in those who are really strongly attracted to one sex or the other, so that we could have one group of stimuli that's very motivationally relevant and the other one that they could really care less about. And our ratings prove that when they say that, in fact, they find, let's say, men to be more attractive, their ratings show that their preferred sex they really do find to be more attractive. But importantly, simply withholding a motor response from these stimuli is enough to have a significant impact on their ratings of how sexually attractive these images are, for both preferred sex and for the non-preferred sex images. So that's all right. This shows that this inhibitory devaluation effect that we had before, you inhibit or ignore something, you reduce its salience, its emotional salience, that's fine. But let's move beyond that, because we're not just interested in people's subjective impressions. We want to know about the motivational impact. So not just the liking, what we're really interested in is the wanting, right? Because wanting, the motivation to expend time and energy to acquire something, is really what people have difficulty with. People don't report so much like, oh, the intensity of my affective valence is too high. It's like, no, I'm spending all night on my computer surfing porn rather than doing my homework or something like that. So can inhibitory devaluation also reduce an item's motivational incentive? So how can we measure the amount of time and energy that people are willing to expend to be able to acquire these images? Well, we did this with a key press approach. So we took entirely heterosexual males. We had half of them repeatedly inhibit male images, the other half repeatedly inhibit female images, and then we gave them a what's behind the door task. You got 4 doors, you press a key, you see what's behind door number 1, you get a brief flash of that image. If you like what you see, you can go back to that door, but now you have to press twice as many times as you did previously to see what's behind that door again. So this is a progressive ratio task. The first time I press once, I see, ooh, I like that, now I have to press twice. If I want to see it again, I press 4 times, then 8 times, then 16 times, and you'll be amazed at how frequently somebody will press a key, a couple people up to a couple hundred times, to see a 1-second peep, if you will, of a scantily clad image. And this is this isn't a clinical population. This is just our Guelph undergraduates. however you interpret that. Yeah, that's right. So what we have with this task is a way to measure how much time, how many key presses, how much work are these people willing to do to be able to obtain this motivationally relevant stimulus. And basically what we find is that people are willing to work fairly hard to see their preferred stimulus, but if they've just previously withheld a simple motor response on a number of trials, that task is only about 15 minutes long. To a 15-minute task in which they withhold those motor responses, that significantly reduces the amount of work. That significantly reduces the motivational incentive to be able to go after and acquire this image. And the size of this effect, it's about 50%, just under 50% of the amount of work that they would be doing otherwise. We think, at least we hope, this is promising in giving the edge over those situations, combined with other things. Take this from, sexually explicit images to drug-associated cues to those associated with you name it. Whatever sort of problem that people have with specific types of stimuli, this may offer a way for us to be able to help these individuals gain an edge over the signals, the incentive motivational salience that these sorts of stimuli have. Right, so what's next is to try to take these tasks and further be able to develop them, applying them to drug-associated cues, to food, to problem gambling-related cues. And in fact, we're not the only ones who've stumbled upon this. Hubin and her colleagues in the Netherlands have found similar effects. They have people repeatedly inhibit images of chocolate, people who report having difficulty resisting chocolate, and those who've withheld responses from chocolate significantly reduced their consumption of it for a week following. Similarly, they've done this with people who have problems drinking, who maybe don't fit a standard alcohol, severe alcohol dependence, but who report having problems with alcohol, and repeatedly inhibiting a response to beer-associated cues, in this case, significantly reduced their consumption of alcohol and their ratings of how enjoyable it was for the week afterwards. So all of this is, again, simple computer-based tasks that capitalize on this fact that we have cognitive control signals that help to turn down the volume on these sorts of signals, that also have affective consequence, that make them less appealing overall. What about younger populations? Everything I've talked about that we've done has really been in older populations. So Anne got the opportunity to do her practicum at Yale. So she spent 4 months at the Yale Developmental Electrophysiology Lab that's ran by Linda Mays. You can see Linda there. And so she looked at a sample of 31 participants aged 13 to 17 doing a very similar go, no-go task, although this time, thankfully, you'll be thankful, it's just of faces. Now we're doing again based on hair color. But now we ask them, how kind is this person afterwards? So the idea is, We know inhibitory control increases, gets stronger throughout adolescence. Does this mean that it has to be a certain threshold before they're able to exert this sort of inhibitory devaluation, before there's affective consequences? Or maybe it's there but increases over time? This is the question that we're asking. So what do we find? Certainly inhibitory devaluation, the usefulness of this doesn't seem to be restricted to people over the age of 17, which all of the work previously had shown. And what we show is this age-related increase. As you see, the GO stimuli, those that they're making a response to, that doesn't really change with age. It goes up and down a little bit, but that's a pretty flat line. But this line for how much do you dislike something that you've withheld a response for, that increases quite dramatically with age. The strength of these inhibitory signals, whether it's through development of the cognitive control system itself or through the connections that it has to these subcortical structures to deliver the signals to say, you know, I've inhibited that thing, it was a pain, so I don't want to see that again. Whatever, whether through connectivity or through just development itself, it is clearly having this age-related effect. So what does this mean? We've got this developmental emergence, it seems. Beyond 13 seems to be the point at which we really start seeing these effects take place. And what we've linked this to, in part, is we've talked about using inhibitory devaluation as a tool to help people with specific impairments of self-control. But what we think really happens is that we're using this all the time, that this is in fact part of the cognitive control system. You've engaged with something, or you've been able to successfully avoid something because you know that it's problematic. When you do that, you devalue that thing so that next time you come across that situation, it has less motivational incentive. It's less powerful, less tempting, if you will, on the second time. That's why, you know, the more that you practice self-regulation, the more you get better at self-regulation. In part, that may be about strengthening these cognitive control systems. The other part may be about you literally being able to change the affective and motivational signal of those stimuli that would otherwise be problematic. And so, at least in this paper that we've just submitted, we've talked about the relation between that as a possible mechanism for helping, and why we see reduced risk-taking as we get older in adolescence. So what else can we do, right? Certainly this may be an important aspect of control and self-regulation, and it gets better with adolescents. But what about for those in whom it's not fully developed, right? We know self-regulation involves some inhibitory control. There's certain things that we encounter in our environment that aren't always appropriate to respond to, and some people seem to have problems controlling those sorts of responses, but we know that that kind of inhibitory control isn't fully developed. So what can we do in those, even for those for whom it's not fully developed? And we've approached this in terms of a warm-up, right? We talked about ego depletion, where you've been so taxed, you've been working so hard to exert self-control that now it becomes difficult to do that later on. We don't want to do that, but instead, just like an athlete before they run a race, they warm up, they get blood flowing, they get those mechanisms, muscles, whatever, working. It's the same idea. So we gave individuals very simple practice with one group of people looking at individual digits, and for those who we give some practice at inhibiting things, we have them do, it's a go, no go response again, but if you see the number 3, don't make a response. Any other digit, make a response. And then the frequency of those go signals increases over time, which means because those no-go signals are less frequent, it becomes harder to inhibit. So we do this for about 5 minutes or so, give them this little bit of practice. The non-inhibitory control group, we do the exact same thing, but instead of withholding a response for number 3, you just simply press a different key. So less inhibition overall. And what do we find? Is afterwards, we give them a measure of self-regulation. And we actually did it before and after this inhibitory practice. And the specific task that we used in this case was, how long can you hold a hand grip exerciser? Which might seem like a bit of an odd task to give somebody for self-regulation, but others in the literature have used it fairly frequently because it turns out that how long you can hold a hand grip exerciser has less to do with your hand grip strength than about, pardon my colloquialism, but how much of a wuss you are in giving in to those, you know, oh, my hand's getting tired and I'm, you know, starting to give in. What do we find is that people will hold the hand grip exerciser for longer after they've warmed up these inhibitory control mechanisms, which we take as evidence that with effective inhibitory control, you get those feelings of, oh, I'm getting tired, I want to give up, and you're better able at being able to turn down the signals on those sorts of other competing signals. So Asma has also found the exact, as my other PhD student, Asma Hanif, who's done this work, and has found the exact same thing. We've replicated this pattern of data using another task in case the hand grip exerciser doesn't win you over. Another form of self-regulation is we give people an anagram task. They have a bunch of scrambled up letters, and the first few, they get to unscramble them, they form words, that's fine, but at a certain point, the anagrams become unsolvable. So it doesn't matter how long they continue to work on them, they're not going to get the answer. And we measure how long do they persist in the face of that frustration. So that's another form of self-regulation. We get the exact same pattern of data. So this is another approach, looking at it instead from how can we increase the effectiveness of these cognitive control mechanisms. How might we be able to adapt this for work with for children or adolescents? People like Durston and B.J. Casey and others have done a lot of work with kids in inhibitory control, and they simply adapt the stimulus set. So now instead of see a 3, don't make a response, you make it a little bit more engaging. You show them Pokemon things, and you say, anytime you see Meowth, don't make a response, something like that. So again, we've shown that inhibitory devaluation, inhibition, the affective consequences still hold up even in adolescence, even though they improve. But maybe through the use of some of these warm-up techniques, we might be able to, when you know a kid's going into a challenging situation, be able to give a little bit of a warm-up, prime those mechanisms to be able to help out a little bit. So again, between these two, and these are just the two that we've been doing some research on lately, but hopefully you can see the similarities in terms of the different therapeutic approaches that would also target these different mechanisms, right? So we have a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy that's about thinking about a scenario, how appealing is that really? What are, instead of the, just the pros, what about the cons? What do you really want to do? What do you really want to achieve? What are your long-term objectives? Things that are basically about tilting the scale against that maladaptive signal and towards something that's a little bit more adaptive in the long term. Enhancing cognitive control. We heard a little bit about mindfulness, meditation. I could give a whole other talk on meditation. Lots and lots of excellent work on meditation. How, with stress, disruptions in emotion regulation, you get increases in density of areas like the amygdala. Through practice of meditation, not only do you increase cortical thickness in cognitive control areas, but you also simultaneously decrease the density of areas that are driving these emotion-related, emotion-driven responding, like the amygdala. Work by people like Sarah Lazar at MGH, Mass General Hospital, which is where I was at Harvard before coming to Guelph. So lots of different ways. These are the 2 points at which we really try to target these things. So other ways to enhance self-control: humor, positive affect, broaden the focus of attention. Asma's done some other work that shows if you can just get people to sort of see the forest rather than the trees, think about rumination, think about a lot of maladaptive thought processes. What does that have to do with inappropriate level of focus, high focus on one certain type of thought without and ignoring all of these other things going on at the same time? We find that we can enhance self-regulation even by doing a task, say having letters like the letter A made up of little letter E, right? So they could either respond at the local level, high focus, or at the global level, broad focus. And by having people do a block of the broad focus, we can enhance their self-regulation. Meditation, which I've just mentioned. Whole literature and growing literature, the attention restoration theory about the benefits of getting out into nature. How in many ways you can think of getting out to nature as a kind of massage for these executive cognitive control systems. It engages them, but it's not in this very strongly bottom-up kind of way that is often problematic. So other things, lots of evidence from Baumeister and his group about the more we practice self-regulation, the better we get at self-regulation. And as I read through a lot of this work, it kind of made me appreciate all the what I thought was nagging I used to get as a kid. Don't come to the breakfast table without combing your hair, do your, make your bed every morning, all these things that I thought were a real pain. But in many ways, these are just you being mindful of what you do and controlling your behavior, not always giving in to the immediate emotional impulse. That can help to strengthen self-regulation in the long run. following an exercise program, following a study program, just adhering to these things engages self-control. The more you do that, the better that you get in the future. And there's some hope, I would say, if you're dealing with people who've got specific problems with self-control, especially anyone who's dealing with substance dependence, the idea of willpower and lack of self-control is a big idea. This idea that through repeated exercise of self-control, you get better. In fact, you can become amongst the best in the world at exercising self-control. There's been some work like this study looking at ex-smokers, doing tests of willpower, self-control, showing that ex-smokers show significantly better self-control than non-smokers, people who've never ever smoked, which you would think is entirely counterintuitive. These are, after all, the weak-willed saps who spent all of the years smoking to begin with. But quitting is so difficult. Resisting the impulse to smoke is I used to smoke, I quit smoking, I can personally attest, it is very painful. I'd make it to about day 3 in my attempts to quit before I'd rather poke a pencil through my eye than continue to not smoke. So to be able to deal with those very powerful cravings requires a lot of self-control. So for individuals who become successful at quitting smoking or some other addiction, they have lots of practice, and that practice ends up showing itself as better and improved self-control in other areas, not just that related to the addiction. So you can tell people who are struggling with that if they keep at it, they can be better than other people who've never even had those problems to begin with. So the final thing that I want to talk about, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I hope that you'll see how it's connected, is some recent work that we've been doing on boredom. And boredom, it turns out, even though it's pretty much a universal experience, we've all been bored at some point. Anybody who's had kids or worked with kids knows that that's a major thing that they complain about. I'm bored. What can I do? I'm bored. Despite the universal experience, despite the fact that it's associated with lots and lots of problematic outcomes, there is very, very little work that's been done on boredom. We heard this morning about the high road and low road of fear perception. We know so much about fear and how the brain works and how we pick up those visual features. We know next to nothing when it comes to boredom. What goes on in the brain when you're bored? We don't know. Nobody's done the study. We really know nothing about boredom, other than little bits of people talking about it from a philosophical angle, the existential angst of being bored, whether it has to do with life meaning, whether it has to do with your ability to put your emotions into words. So some work that I've done really with John Eastwood is the guy at York University, my friend and colleague, who's really helped to break open the study of boredom more recently. We've got other great people here at Waterloo, James Dankert at University of Waterloo, and Dan Smiluk also doing some good work on it. And the first point with all of this is just for people to realize that boredom isn't trivial. We often think that I'm bored, well, just flip the channel, engage in some other activity, but it really has some serious consequences, even to being associated with increased mortality. Literally, you can be bored to death, it seems, when you look at this data linking your proneness to boredom and mortality. But I'd say for the crowd here, part of why I wanted to talk about it is because of this other literature showing that the extent to which individuals are prone to be bored has significant impact on their treatment outcomes. Adherence to whatever sort of therapeutic or rehabilitative technique that you have, if it's boring, they're going to be less likely to do it. People with traumatic brain injury, other populations especially, are affected by boredom and have this link. So the first idea, and kind of a counterintuitive idea that I'd like to present about this, is that although there's lots of different viewpoints about what boredom is, in fact, there's not a whole lot of agreement. And this, we think, is part of the reason why there's been so little research done on it. What is it? Is it an emotional experience? Is it a motivational experience? Is it a simple lack of arousal, as people in the 60s and 70s talked about it? What exactly is boredom? And because it's got so many different facets, it's been really difficult to come to some common definition to even move forward. And so a paper that we just recently published tried to make that common definition. And so what we see across all of these different perspectives is that somebody who's bored really wants to engage in some sort of satisfying activity, as we all do, but is somehow unable to. They can't become engaged in that satisfying activity, and as a result, they experience boredom, this experience of being disengaged from that situation and being stuck in this very dissatisfying, seems like endless present, right? Time perception. When you're bored, time drags on forever. And our contribution here is to suggest that this idea about becoming disengaged, your inability to engage with a satisfying activity, really has to do with attention, really has to do with these cognitive control mechanisms and the balance between these cognitive control mechanisms and these other parts of the brain that this connectivity develops through adolescence. So here's just an example, one example of attention and cognitive control. We've already talked a little bit about this. What does it have to do with boredom? And here's the counterintuitive part. So on one hand, you'd say, well, in order for me to not be bored, I would really need to be good at engaging my attention in a given task. Right? This is probably why kids with ADHD experience so much boredom, is because of their difficulty focusing attention. They can't keep focused. The activity isn't rewarding because they keep having these disruptions. That's one part of it. The other part, which is also very problematic, is the fact that some of the things that we have to do in life aren't very much fun. And if your attention is so highly focused on how not fun what you're doing is right now, what are you going to do? You're going to be bored. You're not going to be able to complete that task. So Fisher in 1998 had this study where they had some people doing a very menial task, required a very limited amount of attention or limited cognitive demands. And they found that when they added a slight distraction in the background, that actually the people were better at doing the task and reported less boredom overall. So this is the idea. A lot of what I've talked about today is about how can we have better cognitive control? How can we have better ability to control these signals? And the flip side of that is that there's some situations in which you want to have less control. You want to have less focus. But being distracted can sometimes be a good thing. And in fact, this really became driven home for me. As a professor, I teach research methods. If anybody's taken introductory research methods, you know how absolutely wonderful and engaging the material is just on its own. The teacher doesn't have to hardly do anything. Not at all. I get up there and people are moving and they're, drawing and they're talking and they're Facebooking and everything. And at first I used to just get really annoyed. I'd be like, do you know how much time I spent preparing this lecture? For this 45 minutes that I'm up here, you can at least pretend to be interested. Like just look at me throughout this. That's all I ask. But learning a little bit more about this literature, the more that I've come to appreciate that actually their fidgeting, their restlessness may actually be their coping mechanism. And so we see this also, the H in ADHD, the hyperactivity part, you might think of that as, well, these kids lack self-control. They can't, exert control over their behavior, so they're moving around all the place. The alternate view is that in order to pay attention to somebody, it requires a certain level of arousal, right? So in the afternoon, after we've eaten lunch, how many people went and got a cup of coffee? Well, what does that coffee do? That increases cortical arousal, which means that you're better able to engage attention. For individuals with suboptimal levels of arousal, how do you increase? Well, ADHD, we do that by giving stimulants. We prescribe things like Ritalin. The other way you can increase cortical arousal is by moving. If I give you a tennis ball and have you squeeze that tennis ball repeatedly and measure brain activity, what I'm going to see is initially increased activity in motor areas, but that activity will spread across the hemisphere with enough time. So the fidgeting, the doodling, all of that can artificially raise levels of arousal, increase focus of attention. And now there's at least some preliminary work to show, even in classroom settings, that if you give everybody a fidget toy, something that they can play with, a little rubber brain or something like that that they can play around with, that those individuals with the fidget toy have better learning outcomes than those who are forced to sit still and do better. Another study that shows that if you give people something to doodle, you need to fill in, shade in these geometric shapes, while I have this really boring seminar on research methods, that you're actually going to do better in retaining that material and do better ultimately. So we've talked about this and been thinking about this not only in terms of fidgeting, but also in terms of mind wandering. Because mind wandering is often thought of as like the hallmark of failure of attention. But in fact, what we see is that in certain situations, a bit of mind wandering can actually help you to retain that material. So again, with limited time, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, except to say that increasingly what we're finding is that many of our sort of common conceptions of inattention. Things like, kids that are mind-wandering, kids that are daydreaming, the fidgeting, the doodling. Depending on the situation, that might not be a bad thing, right? That can actually increase alertness and attentiveness, facilitate insight, innovation, adaptive problem solving. The whole other flip side to this, even in individuals who don't have problems with boredom or with other things, has to do with creativity and innovation. I wrote a column for the Globe and Mail about why do I get my best ideas in the shower. And it really puzzled me for a long time. And really the ideas that I was talking about were, what am I going to write about for the Globe and Mail column this week? And I'd be like, oh, I got to come up with something to get back to my editor. And I go in, sit in front of my computer in my office and kind of be racking my brain and be like, I got nothing. Get into the shower, and in 5 minutes, I'm like, oh, I could write about that. I could write about that as I'm, doing the shampoo, lather, and stuff like that. I'm like, this is weird. What is it about the shower? What is it about the shower? It's not a cognitively challenging task. I don't need to focus on how much conditioner I put in my hand. I've done that so many times, but it's a place where my mind can wander, and, in that space of period, you have these freely associative thoughts, and you can just make one thing connect to the other and really go through. So, I'll leave it there just to say that hopefully what I've been able to portray is that understanding a little bit about where these brain signals come from and the competition between them as they relate to self-control can give us some ideas about ways that we can better approach these things and help people out. That's it for me. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
The last thing you're talking about, and we run a whole bunch of learning workshops for the field, and we've come to bring pipe cleaners and little gadgets and things like that. They're on the table, and some people go to them right away and use them all the time. And I just kind of look at them and say, what are you doing that for? Because the individual difference in the need to do that is marked. And some people have come to us and said, thank you for letting me do that because I was able to pay attention better just because you let me do that. Yeah. So the whole idea of individual difference is like if every classroom prescribed a squeaky toilet to everybody in their class, it doesn't mean that it's going to be the right intervention for every class. You're right. So the application of this on an individualized basis becomes even more important.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I have to emphasize the same disclaimer that we heard this morning. What I'm talking about, these are all based for the most part on group averages, looking at individual differences, although in the boredom literature, that's pretty much all that people have done so far. You identify through a questionnaire how prone somebody is to boredom, and then you look for how that relates to other aspects of cognitive and emotional functioning. The real change, though, is that nobody's looked at what happens in the acute experience of boredom itself, and that's where John Eastwood and other people really started making some headways. But you're absolutely right. It really depends on who the person is.
Just wondering if you looked at sort of comparing your findings to some of the work on temperament, because there seems to be a good relationship, for example, effort for control. And even recovery time has some application on self-regulation, and there's lots of work in terms of helping kids, and there's lots of research on the failures of children who don't have effortful control, and those who have great success when they have that. And it seems like there's a great cross relationship, and that some of the stuff we should be doing earlier with kids. The marshmallow test.
Yeah. No, exactly. And what I would say is, I haven't been doing a lot of that work myself, but I'm aware that it's out there. The challenge for us initially is just, especially for me, coming at it from basic research to, all right, how can we start applying this in ways to help people out? And the very first part is just, all right, let's start applying the task to something that's relevant. And then how do we deal with individual differences? And that's the real big challenge, because as soon as you do that, you start, okay, well, let's include this measure. We'll look at, BIS-BAS, behavioral inhibition versus activation, or let's look at, reward sensitivity versus, punishment, or things like that. Well, our wish list of things to include suddenly becomes really, really large. And so that's been our challenge so far, is to be able to sift through and say what's really going to be important. And that's where, my collaboration with John Eastwood is really helpful. He is a clinical psychologist. He's aware of all of those scales, and he's done a lot more work, including things like with boredom, the role of alexithymia, your ability to articulate emotions, emotional experience, also role of feeling of life meaning, having a huge role in the extent to which you're likely to experience boredom and experience the negative consequences that go along with it. So just beginning is the short answer.
We've got time.
Yeah.
So I find it particularly interesting the boredom aspect, because I suffered from very severe postpartum depression, mentioned with the disengagement and stuff too, I can kind of see how it sort of fits into that, and then the attachment and
Yeah.
kind of that. So I don't know if there's been any studies that link.
James Dankert here in Waterloo's probably done some of the best work relating boredom to depression, and especially his work with his student Yael Goldberg, trying to differentiate between anhedonia aspect of boredom from low levels of arousal to trying to figure out, is this all part of the same thing? How can we disentangle these different aspects? What are the consequences? And a big part of what he's finding is that there's huge individual differences in whether you have a more agitated type of boredom, right, which is like, I'm bored, I'm going out of my skull, versus whether you have more passive, kind of like, I could care less, I have no urge to even get up off this couch, and yet I still am going out of my skull, right? And so from his perspective, and the work that what they're advocating is that identifying those individual differences and the type of boredom or how you experience boredom is going to be critical for the clinical intervention that you choose. Dankert, D-A-N-C-K-E-R-T. Yeah, hear about it. Yeah.
Just wondering if you could maybe comment on the shelf life or how the persistence of the devaluation of the stimuli, is that if someone accomplishes that, does it persist?
That's an important question, and one that we're just starting to look at now. And it started, just to give you the full background, even within the realm of attention and cognitive control, when people talk about time course there, usually it's like, does this last more than 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, 300 milliseconds? So when in our initial studies, the fact that we found it lasting more than 3 seconds, we said, this is clearly something that involves memory. It's not just a purely intentional phenomenon. So the best work that we have right now, we've got up to a day. So we do the study, bring people back a day later, still show significant devaluation. The next part is to go to the week to the, because obviously from a practical point of view, if we, let's say, we've started with testing with some individuals at Stonehenge. We show that, in fact, people with a long history of substance dependence, first, that they can still show inhibitory devaluation, right? That their history of drug abuse hasn't impaired their inhibitory control so much that it doesn't work. But the next is, if we do give them ignore the hypodermic needle or the crack pipe or whatever it is, how long is that going to last? And other important questions is it just that specific crack pipe, or will it generalize to other? And fortunately for us, so far everything points to the generalization. We get more generalization than we do item specifics.
So, sorry, Mark.
That's right.
It does look like we have people coming in. Mark, thank you. I want to say, this is very exciting. I've been in the field for over 30 years. That's aging me, I know. But I thought I knew everything, or almost everything. But this opens up a whole new journey for me, and I hope it also opens up a journey for you as well. Thanks for making it so that we can understand it. Thanks for making it so that we can actually use it. And I just wish that I could get my teachers from back in school when I used to get my paper taken away from me because I was doodling. In fact, I learned to write backwards so well that I could write essays backwards.
Oh, wow.
But it was the only way I could pay attention to what was happening at the moment. Otherwise, I was drifting and I was off. So thank you. It's a privilege.
Thank you.
Good to know you. Thanks.